They called him the Ghost of Bitterroot. For 7 long, brutal years, Jedediah Rollins hadn't spoken a word that wasn't strictly necessary, and he certainly had never smiled. His face was a hardened map of tragedy, carved by unforgiving western winters and a grief so deep it terrified the folks of Pine Bluff. He was a wild, savage thing of the mountains. But everything changed on a dusty Tuesday afternoon when a battered, overweight widow and her ragged little girl stood in his path. The town held its breath, expecting violence. Instead, the little girl looked up at the terrifying giant and uttered 6 words that would shatter his frozen heart. The wind howling through the Bitterroot Mountains carried a chill that could snap a man's bones. But Jedediah Rollins barely felt it anymore. At 42, Jedediah was a towering monument of a man, clad in worn bear hide and elk leather, his face obscured by a thick, untamed beard and hair that hadn't seen a barber's shears since the spring of 1875. The townsfolk of Pine Bluff, Idaho Territory, whispered that Jedediah was more beast than man. They avoided his eyes when he made his infrequent trips down the mountain for supplies, fearful that looking too closely at him would invite the very curse that had consumed his life. 7 years ago, Jedediah had been a different man. He had been a homesteader with a booming, hearty laugh, a beautiful wife named Rebecca, and a 2-year-old son, Samuel. They had built a modest cabin nestled in the Loa Valley, carving out a slice of paradise in the rugged frontier. But the winter of 75 had been merciless. A freak avalanche, sudden and deafening, had swept down the western ridge while Jedediah was 10 miles away checking his trap lines. When he returned, there was no cabin. There was only a suffocating ocean of white. Jedediah had dug for 3 days with his bare hands, his fingernails torn from the beds, the flesh of his fingers worn down to the bone. When he finally found them, the cold had already claimed them. Something inside Jedediah snapped that day, burying his soul under the same ice that had taken his family. He retreated higher up the mountain, into the treacherous peaks where no sane man dared to tread. For 7 years, he survived on isolation and pure, stubborn grit. He hadn't smiled since. The muscles in his face had forgotten how to form the expression, locking into a perpetual, terrifying scowl that kept the world at a safe, unbridgeable distance. Miles below Jedediah's solitary existence, the bustling, mud-soaked town of Pine Bluff was entirely devoid of sympathy for broken things. It was a place where survival of the fittest was the only law that truly mattered. Into this harsh crucible stepped Martha Higgins. Martha was a widow of only 3 months, having lost her husband William to a vicious bout of cholera on the grueling wagon trail from Missouri. William's death had left Martha utterly destitute, stranded in Pine Bluff with a mountain of debt to the ruthless local banker, Thaddeus Montgomery, and a 6-year-old daughter, Daisy, to protect. Life on the frontier was unforgiving for any woman without a husband, but for Martha, it was a waking nightmare. She was a heavily overweight woman, a physical trait that, in the lean, hungry West, made her an immediate target for cruel assumptions and relentless mockery. The town gossips, led by the bitter and sharp-tongued Abigail Preston, whispered that Martha was a glutton, a lazy burden who had likely eaten her own husband out of house and home. They couldn't see the truth, that Martha's weight was a stubborn biological inheritance, an affliction that only made her desperate, back-breaking labor all the more exhausting. To keep a dilapidated roof over Daisy's head, Martha took on the jobs no one else wanted. She scrubbed the blood-stained floors of the local slaughterhouse, hauled heavy, waterlogged laundry for the saloons, and mended filthy, lice-ridden clothes deep into the night. Her large frame ached constantly, her joints screaming in protest with every heavy step she took. Her hands were raw, cracked canyons of blistered skin, permanently stained with lye soap and dirt. Yet, despite the physical agony and the cruel, snickering stares of the townsfolk, Martha endured. She swallowed her pride daily, putting on a brave, gentle face for Daisy. Daisy was a small, fragile thing, a stark contrast to her mother's imposing size. With big, observant brown eyes and a smattering of freckles, she was a quiet child who had seen far too much sorrow for her age. She watched her mother work herself to the bone, watched the townsfolk sneer and step around them as if they carried the plague. Daisy didn't understand the cruelty of the world, but she understood her mother's love. Martha was her entire universe, a soft, warm, protective barrier against the cold reality of Pine Bluff. As November approached, the air in the valley grew brittle and sharp, signaling the onset of the brutal Idaho winter. For Martha, the dropping temperatures brought sheer panic. She barely had enough coin to buy oats and beans, let alone firewood or winter coats. The debt collector, Montgomery, was threatening to turn them out into the street by the end of the month. Martha was trapped, cornered like a wounded animal, her spirit fraying with every passing day. And high above, on the snow-capped peaks, Jedediah Rollins was packing his mules, preparing for his final supply run before the mountain passes closed for the season. Two broken, isolated worlds were on a direct collision course, completely unaware of the dramatic twist fate had prepared for them. The day Jedediah descended into Pine Bluff, the sky was the color of bruised iron. A biting wind whipped dust and dry snow through the main street, driving most sensible folks indoors. When Jedediah's massive fur-clad figure emerged through the haze, leading two heavily burdened mules, the street practically emptied. Men tipped their hats and hurried away. Women pulled their children inside and bolted their doors. The ghost of Bitterroot had returned. Jedediah tied his mules outside Ezekiel Potts's general store and outfitting. The store was the lifeblood of the town, filled with the pungent smells of tanned leather, strong tobacco, roasted coffee, and kerosene. Jedediah pushed the heavy wooden door open, the brass bell above it chiming a weak, rattling sound. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Ezekiel Potts, a wiry, sour-faced man with a heart as tight as his purse strings, was standing behind the counter, his face flushed with anger. Kneeling on the rough-hewn floorboards near the front counter was Martha Higgins. She was scrubbing a massive, sticky spill of molasses, her heavy breaths rattling in her chest. Sweat plastered her graying hair to her forehead, and her worn cotton dress was soaked with freezing water. Sitting quietly on a pickle barrel nearby was little Daisy, clutching a ragged doll and watching her mother with wide, anxious eyes. "I told you, Mrs. Higgins, I ain't paying you a full day's wage for half-witted work," Ezekiel barked, slamming his hand on the counter. "You knocked over the jar of premium molasses with your bulk. You're lucky I'm not making you pay for it out of your own pocket. Now finish scrubbing and get out. You're scaring off my paying customers." Martha paused, her shoulders trembling. She slowly pushed herself up, her knees popping audibly in the quiet room. "Mr. Potts, please?" Her voice was soft, laced with a desperate exhaustion that would have broken a lesser man. "I worked out back chopping wood for 4 hours before this. Daisy needs cough syrup. I'm begging you. Just the syrup, and you can keep the rest of the wages." "I don't run a charity for the slow and the heavy," Ezekiel sneered, turning his back on her. It was then that Ezekiel finally noticed the mountain man standing in the doorway. Jedediah filled the frame, his deep-set, dark eyes taking in the scene. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet another 10 degrees. Ezekiel's arrogant demeanor instantly vanished, replaced by a nervous, fawning smile. "Mr. Rollins! I didn't see you come in. Good to see you, sir. I have your winter order ready in the back. Premium powder, salt, the works." Jedediah ignored the store owner. His gaze was locked on Martha. He watched as she wiped her bruised, exhausted face with a filthy apron, her heavy chest heaving as she tried to gather whatever dignity she had left. She reached out, taking Daisy's small hand, preparing to walk out into the freezing wind with absolutely nothing. For 7 years, Jedediah had felt nothing but a hollow, echoing void in his chest. He didn't care about town politics, he didn't care about debts, and he certainly didn't care about people. But something about the utter, pathetic desperation in the large woman's eyes, and the protective way she shielded her child, tugged at a rusted, long-forgotten gear in his mind. With heavy, deliberate footsteps, Jedediah walked toward the counter. His boots thumped against the floorboards like a slow heartbeat. He reached into his thick coat, pulled out a massive, pristine silver fox, pelt a rarity that was worth more than Ezekiel's entire monthly stock, and slammed it onto the glass counter. The glass shuddered under the impact. Jedediah didn't look at Ezekiel. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, gravelly rumble, coarse, from years of disuse. It sounded like grinding stones. Give the woman the medicine, and a sack of flour, and blankets. Ezekiel blinked, stuttering. Mr. Rollins, this pelt. This is worth $50. Her supplies are barely $3. Jedediah slowly turned his massive, scarred head, locking his terrifying, unblinking gaze onto the store owner. Did I stutter, Potts? No, sir. Ezekiel scrambled, almost falling over himself as he rushed to grab a bottle of syrup, a heavy sack of flour, and 2 thick wool blankets. He shoved them onto the counter toward Martha. Martha stood frozen in shock. She looked at the towering mountain man, her heart pounding in her chest. She had heard the rumors about him. They said he was a murderer, a wild man who ate raw meat and conversed with wolves. Yet, here he was, throwing away a fortune to save her and her daughter. Sir, Martha stammered, her voice shaking, I can't take this. I have no way to repay a debt this large. Jedediah finally looked at her. His face was a mask of granite. There was no warmth in his eyes, no gentle savior's grace, just a hardened, weary emptiness. Ain't a debt, he grunted, turning abruptly on his heel to gather his own supplies. He wanted to leave. He hated the town, he hated the noise, and he hated the sudden, uncomfortable prickling in his chest. As he moved toward the door, a tiny, high-pitched voice stopped him in his tracks. Mister? Jedediah paused. He slowly looked down. Daisy had let go of her mother's hand and stepped directly into his path. She was barely as tall as his knees. Ezekiel gasped from behind the counter. Martha's hands flew to her mouth in terror, terrified the wild man might lash out at the child. Daisy tilted her head, studying the jagged scar that ran down Jedediah's left cheek and the deep, sorrowful lines etched around his eyes. Why do you look so mad? She asked innocently. The silence in the store was absolute. Ezekiel swallowed hard, whispering a prayer. Child, step away from him, he hissed. Folks say he's cursed. He ain't smiled in 7 years. Daisy didn't move. She looked at Jedediah's terrifying, frozen scowl. Then she looked back at her mother, who was trembling, clutching the sack of flour. Daisy smiled, a bright, genuine beam of light in the dim, dusty store. She looked back up at the towering giant of a man. My mama can fix that, Daisy said, her voice ringing clear and confident. She fixes all the broken things. The words struck Jedediah like a physical blow. Broken things. His breath hitched. For a fraction of a second, the iron mask on his face slipped. His dark eyes widened, and a profound, agonizing wave of emotion washed over him, completely unmooring him. He stared at the little girl, then up at the obese, exhausted widow who was looking at him with tears streaming down her face. Unable to process the violent storm of feelings erupting inside his chest, Jedediah panicked. He tore the door open, practically tearing it off its hinges, and stormed out into the biting wind, leaving his paid supplies sitting on the counter. He mounted his horse and drove his mules hard, fleeing back toward the icy solitude of the Bitterroot Mountains. But as he rode into the gathering blizzard, the little girl's words echoed in his ears, over and over, chipping away at 7 years of solid ice. The blizzard swallowed the Bitterroot Mountains in a blinding, roaring expanse of white for 3 straight days. Inside his solitary cabin, perched on the jagged western ridge, Jedediah Rollins sat before a roaring hearth, though the flames did nothing to chase the bone-deep chill from his blood. For the first time in 7 years, the absolute silence of his isolation was broken. It wasn't the wind rattling the heavy timber logs, nor the distant, haunting howl of timber wolves. It was a phantom sound, echoing relentlessly in the hollow caverns of his mind. Why do you look so mad? My mama can fix that. She fixes all the broken things. Jedediah squeezed his eyes shut, his massive hands gripping the arms of his rocking chair so hard the wood groaned in protest. He tried to summon the familiar, numb emptiness that had protected him since the avalanche took his wife, Rebecca, and his boy, Samuel. He tried to picture the ice. Instead, all he saw were big, observant brown eyes and the trembling, exhausted face of a woman the world had decided was worthless. Martha Higgins. He remembered the raw, blistered state of her hands, the heavy, labored sound of her breathing, and the fierce, protective way she had shielded her daughter from Ezekiel Potts' cruelty. She was fighting a losing battle, and she knew it, yet she stood her ground. Down in the valley, Pine Bluff was suffocating under 3 feet of fresh, heavy snow. For Martha and Daisy, the supplies Jedediah had left them were a miracle, but they were a temporary bandage on a fatal wound. The flour and syrup kept the hunger pangs at bay, and the thick wool blankets provided a cocoon of warmth against the drafty walls of their rented one-room shack. But the calendar was a merciless enemy, and the end of November had arrived. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind died down, leaving the air brittle and so cold it hurt to draw a breath. Martha was at the rusted cast-iron stove, boiling water to make a thin gruel, when the heavy thud of boots sounded on the rotting planks of her porch. The door didn't just open, it was kicked inward, a blast of sub-zero air rushing in. Thaddeus Montgomery stood in the doorway, bundled in a luxurious beaver fur coat, a cigar clamped between his teeth. Behind him stood Hiram Fletcher, a massive, unsmiling brute who handled the banker's less savory evictions, and Deputy Virgil Oakes, who looked distinctly uncomfortable but was entirely in Montgomery's pocket. "Morning, Widow Higgins," Montgomery said, his voice slick and devoid of any genuine warmth. He stepped into the tiny room, his polished leather boots tracking muddy snow onto the floor Martha had scrubbed raw just hours before. He looked around the dismal space with profound distaste. "Rent was due yesterday at sundown. You are 3 months in arrears, plus the outstanding debt on the wagon your late husband purchased. I'm calling the marker." Martha moved instinctively, stepping in front of the small cot where Daisy sat huddled under the mountain man's blankets. "Mr. Montgomery, please. The storm just broke. No one is traveling. I have a job lined up at the Sawmills mess hall starting Monday. I can pay you $1 a week." "$1 a week won't cover the interest, Martha," Montgomery sighed, removing his cigar to inspect the ash. "Besides, I've already sold this lot to the railroad surveyors. They need it cleared by noon. Fletcher, get them out." "You can't do this!" Martha cried out, panic finally breaking through her stoic exterior. Her large frame shook as she grabbed Fletcher's arm as he moved toward the cot. "It's 10 degrees below freezing out there. My daughter will die." Fletcher shoved her aside with casual, terrifying ease. Martha stumbled, her bad knee buckling under her weight, and she crashed hard onto the floorboards. Daisy screamed, scrambling out of the cot to throw her tiny arms around her mother's neck. "Grab whatever you can carry in 2 hands, widow. The rest stays to settle your debts," Montgomery ordered, turning his back. Within 10 minutes, Martha and Daisy were pushed out into the frozen, muddy street. They had nothing but the clothes on their backs, the 2 wool blankets from the mountain man, and a small tin of oats. The townspeople of Pine Bluff peered through frosted windows, watching the spectacle. Some shook their heads in pity, but not a single door opened to offer them sanctuary. Fear of Thaddeus Montgomery and a deep-seated prejudiced apathy toward the heavy, impoverished widow kept the town firmly locked away. Desperate and weeping, Martha dragged herself and Daisy toward the edge of town, to a dilapidated, abandoned livery stable owned by a drunken ostler named Amos Miller. It was barely standing, the roof sagging under the weight of the snow, the wind howling through the wide gaps in the rotting timber. There was no stove, no firewood, just a pile of frozen, foul-smelling straw. "Mama, I'm cold," Daisy whispered, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely form the words. Martha pulled her daughter into the corner, wrapping them both in the thick blankets. She used her own large body as a human shield against the wind blowing through the slats. "I know, my sweet girl. I know," Martha sobbed quietly, kissing the top of Daisy's head. "Just close your eyes. Mama's got you." But Martha's body, pushed far beyond its physical limits by months of starvation, brutal labor, and crushing grief, was finally shutting down. The damp cold of the floor seeped into her bones. By nightfall, a violent fever had taken hold of her. Her breathing became a wet, rattling gasp, and her skin, normally flushed from exertion, turned a terrifying ashen gray. She was succumbing to the frontier's most ruthless killer, pneumonia. As darkness fell over the freezing town, little Daisy sat in the pitch-black stall, holding her unconscious mother's icy hand, praying to a god she hoped was listening, and thinking of the giant man with the sad eyes. High above, the mountain had finally fallen silent. Jedediah stood on the edge of his porch, staring down at the valley below. The moon cast a pale, ghostly light over the endless sea of pine trees. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his son, Samuel, buried under the snow. But then, in his waking nightmares, Samuel's face would morph into Daisy's. Jedediah ran a calloused, scarred hand over his face. He had spent 7 years convincing himself that he was dead, that the avalanche had killed him too, and his body just hadn't realized it yet. He had sworn to never let another human being past his defenses, because to care was to invite the agony of loss. But a rusted gear had turned in his chest. That heavy, broken woman, fighting for her child, she was a mirror reflecting his own past. A past where he hadn't been there to dig fast enough. With a sudden, violent curse that startled the horses in the lean-to, Jedediah turned back into the cabin. He didn't pack traps or hunting gear. He packed medicinal roots, a heavy bearskin rug, dried venison, and a pouch of something he hadn't touched in years. Raw gold nuggets he had panned from a hidden alpine creek, kept only because they were shiny enough to distract him on the darkest nights. He saddled his largest draft horse, a massive black beast named Goliath, and began the treacherous descent in the dead of night. The snow was chest-high on the horse in places, but Jedediah drove him mercilessly, a singular burning purpose overriding his grief. He reached the outskirts of Pine Bluff, just as the gray, weak light of dawn was breaking. The town was dead quiet. Jedediah rode straight to the shack where he had seen Martha carrying the supplies. The door was padlocked. A fresh wooden sign read, "Property of Montgomery Bank." Jedediah's blood ran cold, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with the weather. He spurred Goliath down the main street. He found Amos Miller passed out in an alley behind the saloon, half buried in a snowdrift. Jedediah hauled the drunk ostler up by his collar, lifting him entirely off his feet. "The widow," Jedediah growled, his voice a terrifying, guttural threat. "Where is she?" Amos, terrified out of his wits by the giant, pointed a shaking finger toward the old, collapsing livery at the edge of town. "Montgomery tossed them out yesterday. They're in the old barn. If they ain't froze." Jedediah dropped the man and ran. He didn't bother with the horse. He sprinted through the knee-deep snow, his massive boots kicking up clouds of white powder. He tore the barn door open, the rusted hinges shrieking in the quiet morning. "Martha!" he barked, his voice echoing in the gloom. "Mister?" The voice was so weak he almost missed it. Jedediah rushed to the back stall. What he saw made his massive chest tighten to the point of pain. Daisy was huddled over her mother's chest, trying vainly to share her meager body heat. Martha lay completely motionless. Her lips were a frightening shade of blue, her breathing so shallow it was barely visible. She was dying. Jedediah didn't hesitate. He stripped off his massive bearskin coat and threw it over both of them. Then, in a display of pure, raw strength, he slid his arms under Martha. The townsfolk had mocked her weight, calling her a burden, but to Jedediah, who hauled felled timber and massive elk carcasses for a living, she was simply a life that needed saving. He lifted her effortlessly, cradling her against his chest, and told Daisy to grab the back of his suspenders and follow close. He kicked the barn doors wide open and marched straight down the center of Pine Bluff's main street. The commotion drew people to their windows. Ezekiel Potts stepped out of his store, his jaw dropping. Abigail Preston, the town gossip, gasped from her porch. They watched in stunned silence as the terrifying ghost of Bitterroot, a man who supposedly ate children, carried the town's most despised outcast with the utmost care, a tiny girl trailing in his wake. Jedediah kicked the front door of Dr. Horace Gable's clinic so hard the wood splintered. Dr. Gable, a small, bespectacled man, jumped up from his desk. "Good Lord, man, you can't just—" "Clear the table!" Jedediah roared, the sheer volume of his voice rattling the glass vials in the medical cabinets. He laid Martha gently on the examination table. Dr. Gable, recovering his wits, rushed over. He checked her pulse, his face grim, pneumonia, and severe hypothermia. Her heart is barely beating. We need boiling water, heated bricks, and whiskey. Now, for the next 3 hours, Jedediah didn't leave the room. He hauled water, stoked the clinic stove until the iron glowed cherry red, and sat Daisy on a chair, wrapping her in his own dry woolen sweater. Just as color began to faintly return to Martha's cheeks, the clinic door banged open. Thaddeus Montgomery strode in, flanked by Hiram Fletcher and Deputy Oakes. "Dr. Gable, I demand you turn these vagrants out," Montgomery snapped, slapping a riding crop against his leg. "That woman owes me heavily, and she is trespassing on town charity." "Fletcher, get the child." Fletcher took a step forward. He never took a second. Jedediah moved with a speed that defied his massive size. He crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbed Fletcher by the throat, and slammed him against the clinic wall with such force the plaster cracked. Fletcher, a man who prided himself on his brawn, dangled 2 feet off the floor, gagging, his eyes bulging in terror as he stared into the face of a true predator. Jedediah didn't yell. His voice dropped to a lethal, quiet whisper. "You touch the girl, and I will tear you apart with my bare hands. Do you understand me?" Fletcher managed a frantic nod. Jedediah dropped him in a heap on the floor. He turned slowly to face Montgomery, who had suddenly gone very pale, taking a step backward behind the deputy. Jedediah reached into his leather pouch and pulled out 3 massive chunks of raw, unrefined gold. He threw them onto Dr. Gable's metal tray. They landed with a heavy, undeniable clatter. It was enough wealth to buy Montgomery's bank twice over. "Her debt is paid," Jedediah said, his dark eyes locked on the banker. "The wagon, the rent, whatever else you made up. Paid. If I ever see you look at her again, if I ever hear you speak her name, I will come down from that mountain, and I will burn your bank to the ground, with you inside it." Montgomery swallowed hard, his eyes glued to the gold. He nodded slowly, backing out of the door without another word, Fletcher scrambling after him. The clinic fell silent, save for the crackle of the stove and Martha's ragged breathing. Jedediah walked over to the examination table. He looked down at the woman who had somehow managed to crack the ice around his soul. Her eyelids fluttered, and slowly, agonizingly, they opened. She looked confused, disoriented, until her eyes focused on the giant standing over her. "You!" she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "You came back." Jedediah looked at her, then down at Daisy, who had rushed to her mother's side. The muscles in his face, frozen for 7 agonizing years, twitched. His lips trembled, fighting against the stiff, hardened lines of grief. And then, slowly, miraculously, the corners of his mouth turned upward. It was a small, rusty thing, but it was real. Jedediah Rollins smiled. "Yeah," he rumbled gently, his voice thick with emotion. "I came back, and as soon as you're strong enough to travel, I'm taking you both home." For 2 weeks, Dr. Horace Gable's clinic smelled heavily of iodine, strong coffee, and the sharp scent of burning pine. Miraculously, Martha Higgins did not die. The terrifying blue hue of her lips slowly faded, replaced by the flushed, healthy pink of the living. Jedediah Rollins never returned to his mountain. He became an immovable fixture in the clinic, sleeping on the hard floorboards wrapped in his bearskin coat, a loaded Winchester resting across his massive thighs. The town, driven by a sudden wave of hypocritical guilt and sheer terror of the giant, kept its distance. When the town gossip, Abigail Preston, arrived with a pie, Jedediah's unblinking, silent stare sent her scurrying away in tears. He rebuffed Ezekiel Potts's offer of free supplies by slamming a gold nugget onto the counter. Inside the clinic, the deafening silence of Jedediah's past was replaced by the soft sounds of healing. Daisy treated the terrifying mountain man like a protective bear, showing him her ragged doll. And to Martha's amazement, Jedediah listened. One evening, as long purple shadows stretched across the room, Martha found the strength to sit up. She looked at Jedediah, who was whittling a piece of soft pine by the fire. "Jedediah," she began, her voice raspy but gaining strength. Shid, I owe you my life, but I don't know why a man who doesn't need anyone would do such a thing for a woman like me. She looked down at her heavy, bruised hands. The town is right. I'm just a burden. Jedediah's knife closed with a sharp snap. His dark eyes locked onto hers with breathtaking intensity. The town is full of fools, he rumbled. They look at you and see weight. I look at you and see a woman who chopped cordwood, scrubbed floors until her knees bled, and starved herself so her little girl could eat. I see unyielding grit. You survived a winter that would kill the strongest men. He stood, looking out the window toward the snow-capped peaks. 7 years ago, an avalanche took my wife Rebecca and my boy Samuel. I dug for 3 days, but I wasn't fast enough. I thought the mountain's cold could freeze the memory out of my head, so I became a ghost. But your little girl looked at a monster and told him his heart could be fixed. You ain't a burden, Martha. You're the first real, living thing I've seen in 7 years. Tears streamed down Martha's face. For the first time since her husband died, she didn't feel the crushing weight of being entirely alone. By late December, Martha was fit to travel. Jedediah purchased a heavy iron axle wagon, lined it with furs, and hitched his massive draft horse, Goliath. The journey up the Bitterroot Trail was brutal. The incline was treacherous, winding through narrow, ice-slicked passes bordered by sheer drops that plunged hundreds of feet into the valley. Halfway up, disaster struck at a section known as Devil's Drop. Beneath the fresh powder lay a solid sheet of blue ice. As the wagon rounded the curve, the heavy iron wheels lost their grip, and the back end slid violently toward the cliff's edge. Goliath whinnied in panic, his hooves scrambling as the sheer weight pulled him backward toward the precipice. "Jump!" Jedediah roared, grabbing Goliath's bridle and straining with every ounce of his colossal strength to keep the horse from going over. "Martha! Get the girl out!" Martha shoved Daisy to the safe side of the trail, but she didn't run. She looked at the sliding wagon, then at the thick iron logging chain coiled near the rear axle. The town had mocked her size, but Martha knew the truth of her body. It possessed immense, grounded mass and undeniable power forged from years of grueling labor. Ignoring her recovering lungs, Martha lunged, grabbing the freezing iron chain. She threw her entire massive weight against the slide, digging her boots into a rock crevice. "Pull, Jedediah! Pull!" she screamed. She wrapped the chain around a petrified pine stump protruding from the cliff face, anchoring it with her own body. The chain pulled taut with a violent metallic shriek, biting into her palms, but Martha held fast. Her heavy frame acted as a flawless counterweight, halting the wagon mere inches from the drop. Given the slack, Jedediah let out a deafening roar and heaved Goliath forward. Together, with Martha as the human anchor, they hauled the wagon back onto the trail. Jedediah dropped to his knees, gasping. He looked back at Martha. She was bleeding and exhausted, but her eyes burned with a fierce fire. She had just saved his life, and her daughter's. Jedediah didn't speak. He reached out his scarred hand, pulled her to his chest, and held her with a desperate, fierce grip. She was a partner capable of standing beside him in the wildest corners of the earth. When they finally broke through the timberline to Jedediah's cabin, the sun shone brilliantly off the alpine snow. Jedediah carried Martha inside and built a roaring fire that chased away 7 long years of shadows. Daisy immediately explored the room, reaching under a heavy oak table to pull out a small, carved wooden bear, Samuel's old toy. Daisy held it up with wide, hesitant eyes. "Can I hold him, Mr. Jedediah?" Jedediah looked at the toy. The old ache flared, but it didn't consume him. It was just a memory, softened by the warmth of the fire and the family filling his home. Jedediah knelt to Daisy's eye level and smiled a wide, genuine smile that crinkled his scars. "He's yours now, little bird," he rumbled softly. "Welcome home." In the heart of the Bitterroot Mountains, a man who had lost everything found his soul again. Not through solitude, but through the courage of an outcast widow and the innocence of a child. Martha Higgins proved that true strength isn't measured by cruel whispers, but by undeniable grit. Jedediah Rollins finally laid his tragic past to rest, replacing the bitter ice in his veins with the warmth of a family. If this gritty tale of wild Western redemption and unexpected love kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit like, share it with fellow story lovers, and subscribe for more thrilling frontier sagas. Drop a comment below with your favorite moment. Until next time, keep the fires burning and the stories alive.